Oh, hello everyone. Welcome to Orthodox Shahada again. I'm here this time with Dr. Joshua Sijuwade. Very, very delighted to have him on here. We had him on once before to do a interview with. It's actually the second time this has happened to me. I'm actually so unprofessional again. There we go. Sorry. Yeah. So we had him on to do a review of a debate he did in Speaker's Corner with Mohammed Hijab a while back with Bo. So I thought we'd have him on again just to do a one-on-one because he recently released a couple of really interesting papers. One was a while back, I think. It's called Building the Monarchy of the Father. And the other one is called Monarchical Trinitarianism, a Metaphysical Proposal. And I quite enjoyed reading both of these, more so the former one, because the second one was relies on a fair amount of background reading. So how are you, Josh? And could you just introduce yourself, like give kind of a formal introduction?
Thank you very much, Lewis. Yes, I'm very happy to be back. You've got an awesome channel, so thank you very much for having me on. And yeah, so I currently am a visiting lecturer at the London School of Theology. So that's my sort of teaching aspect. And I'm spending a lot of time at the moment thinking about the doctrine of the Trinity. Hopefully, I'm also going to be focusing on the incarnation soon and other related things like the existence of God. So yeah, I've published a few papers recently, just sort of focusing more on the monarchy of the Father and trying to cash it out sort of in a philosophical way and provide a philosophical elucidation of the doctrine. So yeah, so I'm looking forward to sort of discussing it a little bit further with you.
Yeah, I just want to say to all the viewers that this stream is going to be kind of very technical, I guess to say. And I know we did an interview with Father Stephen DeYoung, which was not so technical last time, but this one's, and so we got a few people that came in and watched that. This channel often gets very technical, and I think this is probably going to be one of the most technical interviews. But hopefully together we can try and simplify things down, and make it accessible. So with respect to the first paper, the Building the Monarchy of the Father, kind of what was your intention behind writing that paper in the first place? What kind of what spurred you into doing that?
Yeah, so I just sort of giving a bit of background. So for my PhD, I focused on the doctrine of the Trinity. Specifically, I was looking at defending a famous model of the Trinity that was proposed by Richard Swinburne. And so it's a social Trinitarian model that tries to argue for the coherence of the doctrine of the Trinity in a social Trinitarian way. And I tried my best to sort of defend it and say, well, actually, this model doesn't seem to be tritheistic, because that was the main objection that I was looking at. And sort of in my reading, I spent a lot of time sort of delving deeper into the pro-Nicene theologians and trying to get sort of a better understanding of their work and seeing what they were teaching about the doctrine of the Trinity. And sort of in my research, I stumbled upon this doctrine of the monarchy of the Father. And it really sort of just took a hold of me because I hadn't encountered it before. And I had sort of, encountered objections to the doctrine of the Trinity, its coherence, and how, monotheism can be grounded in sort of a Trinitarian framework. And it was always bothering me because I was always thinking, actually, the model that I'm researching, I don't think it is tritheistic, but I had problems with trying to understand how it does fit with a monotheistic worldview, specifically if you identify the Trinity as a tri-personal being. It seemed to be a little bit strange how you can ground monotheism. And so I was trying to just see how it could be so. But then when I was looking deeper into the doctrine of the monarchy of the Father, I realized that actually what the pro-Niceans, and so what I mean by the pro-Niceans, the theologians who are working in a specific theological trajectory in the 4th century, who were favorable towards the conciliar declarations made at Nicaea in 325 and Constantinople in 381. So these are specific theologians like the Cappadocian Fathers in the East, so Basil, Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory of Nazianzus, and then you have individuals working in the West. So you have Hilary, You have Ambrose, you have later Augustine. And so you have these theologians who are sort of defending the declarations made at Nicaea and Constantinople. And what I found in their work is that a lot of them were talking about this idea of the Father being the one God. And you saw this clearly in the creeds as well at Nicaea and at Constantinople, that the one God is identified as the Father. Yet there are two other divine persons, the Son and the Spirit, who are homoousios with the Father. That means that they share the same nature, same essence as him. And so you have this idea that the one God is the Father, and that there are three consubstantial divine persons, the Father, Son, and Spirit. And so I saw this idea and I felt that this is amazing. This is an awesome doctrine, because you have a clear understanding of monotheism there. And you don't have to sort of, argue for this tripersonal God and trying to square the circle, because you have a clear understanding that there is one God who's identified as the Father, and then you have these three divine persons. And so the doctrine looked great to me, and I felt actually I want to delve deeper into this in a philosophical way, because I saw the history behind it. I saw the grounding in scripture as well. As your listeners would have obviously seen this through your channel, this seems to be a scripturally grounded and historically grounded position. But I felt that there was needed to be, a little bit more philosophical elucidation of the doctrine itself. What does it mean for the Father to be the one God? So specifically in that paper, that was my main focus. I wanted to find out and sort of delve deeper into this understanding of how the Father is the one God. What does it mean for us to say he's the one God? And yet there is not a subordination when it comes to the Son and the Spirit in an ontological sense. Because what you might see for individuals who would say this doctrine looks great, but they would say, but is there an ontological sort of inequality between the persons, given that the Father is the one God? And so I felt that if we utilize, as analytic sort of theologians and philosophers, the tools and techniques of metaphysics, we can actually cash this out, this doctrine, in a way that allows us to have a robust understanding of what it means for the Father to be the one God, and yet we can still hold to the consubstantiality of the persons. We don't have to hold to an ontological subordination. And so I felt that if we use these tools and techniques of metaphysics, we can bring this to light in a clear way. And that's what I really tried to do in this paper.
Yeah, of course. And before we talk about the specific kind of tools that you end up using, could you hone in on the because of course we want just not just kind of freak the audience out, because I remember when I first introduced the monarchy, some people were like, oh yes, I knew this already, but some people got a little freaked out, and they think that because the word God is used for the Father, the one God is the Father, then therefore we can't call the other two persons God. Could you kind of just cash out I think with Bo, we've gone through about 5 different senses the word God is used, but I think you tend to kind of focus on just 2.
Yeah.
Could you just explain those briefly?
Yeah. So what I understood from my research was, in general, we understand this as theists, is that the word God is an ambiguous word. And that means it can have different senses and can be used in different ways. And specifically what I saw in my research in the pro-Nicene trajectory is that there is at least 2 ways or 2 senses that the word God was understood within that Trinitarian trajectory. And these 2 senses are what I term the nominal sense and the predicative sense. So the nominal sense is just using the word God as a name for an individual. It's a reference term. It's using it as a name. And then the predicative sense is when you are using it in a way that is descriptive. You are saying this individual is God, but you're saying, basically in another way, you're saying they are divine, or this individual is divine. And so if you're using, let's say, more everyday language, you're using a name, the word God is a name, and then you're also using it as an adjective. And so if we're using an example that can help sort of your listeners, the word brown. Okay, the word brown is an ambiguous word. It can be used as a name, so Mr. Brown, or it can be used as an adjective to talk about someone's skin color or their shoes or whatever. And so the word can have 2 different senses, and it's the same way that I'm saying with the word God. It can be used as a name for an individual, or it can be used as a predicate. It can be used in a way to say that this individual has a certain description, which is that of being divine. And so what we then have with this monarchy of the Father doctrine is that the one God and we're using the word God now in the nominal sense, is solely ascribable to the Father. The Father is the individual who bears the name God, and the Son and the Spirit do not bear the name God in that specific way. Yet they are God in the predicative sense, in the same way that the Father is. And so, just sort of saying that in a reverse way, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are each predicated the word God. And so they're God equally in a predicative sense. Yet the Father and the Father alone is God in the nominal sense. So he's the one who has the name God, yet the Son and the Spirit also can be called God, but they are called God not as a name, but as a predicate. Which, and I try to bring this out in the paper. I think it's easier because we can sort of get confused when we're saying God here, and having to change senses. So I would try and say, and I hope people will follow this, that we should use the word God as a name, and then we should substitute the predicative usage of the word God for just the term divine. So we say that there are three divine persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, yet there is one God, the Father. And so the word God, when I say the one God, the Father, it's simply as a name for the Father. And I don't know if we'll probably bring this out a little bit more, but questions will be raised, and I try to answer this in the paper of, well, why is it the Father and the Father alone who bears the name God and not the Son and the Spirit?
Right.
Yeah.
I was just about to bring that up.
Yes.
And just from a historical perspective, I mean, I would just, because of course a lot of my audience is Orthodox, so if any of them here are kind of new and haven't heard of this, this is the basis behind the critique of the Filioque doctrine, that it undermines the Father, because and this was St. Photius's critique, he says that when you say the Son is also a source of the Holy Spirit, you've introduced two principles, and therefore you've introduced two gods. That's in his Mystagogy. St. Basil, in Against the Sabellians, he says, we do not know two gods because we do not know two fathers. And you use this quote from Gregory Nazianzen, where he says, quote, one God unbegotten the Father, and one begotten Lord his Son, referred to as God when he is mentioned separately, but Lord when he is named in conjunction with the Father, the one term on account of his nature, the other on account of his monarchy, and one Holy Spirit proceeding, or if you will, going forth from the Father, unquote. And you notice how he says one on account of his nature, which is indicating the predicative sense that you're talking about here. Oh, this is my understanding. And then and the other on account of his monarchy. And obviously we spoken about this, Dr. Branson. Monarchy means sole cause, sole source, sole principle. And is this how you see, because I'd originally distinguished maybe just a nominal use and the source without source use, but it seems like you're saying he is named God because he is the source without source. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. So that's sort of what I try and bring out in the paper. So in the early part of the paper, I sort of go step by step in my sort of elucidation of the doctrine. So I would say that there is God. The word God can be used in a primary sense and can be used in a secondary sense. The primary sense is the nominal usage, and the secondary sense is a predicative usage. And why it is that primary sense, why it is that nominal sense, and it's solely ascribable to the Father, is because, exactly as you said, he is a source without source. He is the individual who fulfills a certain criteria for being that individual who is ultimate or who is fundamental, which I go on later to, and I think we'll speak about as well.
Right.
Yeah. So
So this is the metaphysical tool that you're employing here. Yeah. You talk about a specific kind of, because there's been a much ado about the use of the word cause to speak of the Father causing the Son, for example. And obviously this sets up a lot of alarms in a lot of people's heads, even though it's perfectly patristic use. But a lot of people who aren't familiar with the patristic use, especially in modern analytics, I suppose, get a bit freaked out by this. But you want to cash this out as what you call or what is, I assume, called in literature, building relation.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So what I try to do, so then just sort of helping you listeners go through the paper. So I am at that I'm at the stage where I'm saying, well, the nominal usage is for the Father alone, and the predicative usage is for each of the persons. Father, Son, and Spirit. Now, the question then is raised, well, why does the Father have the name God and the Son and Spirit don't? And so what I try and bring out is to say, because the Father is the sole fundamental divine person in the Trinity. And so I use this notion of fundamentality to help us understand what it means for the Father to be the one God and why he is the one God as a name and him alone. And so this idea of fundamentality has played quite a big role in recent and contemporary metaphysics. So a lot of philosophers are sort of looking at this idea now, which has been a big change, because a lot of philosophers, if we go back just even 40, 50 years ago in metaphysics, and this is sort of, you know, the West, a lot of philosophers, analytic philosophers, were not going into these deep metaphysical questions, and they were not thinking it's possible. And so fundamentality was not even playing a big part at all in metaphysics until we go into the latter half of the 20th century, going into the 21st century. We have philosophers now saying, actually, this idea of fundamentality is something which we need to go deeper into, because it seems to be an evident part of our reality. And so fundamentality is an idea now that a lot of philosophers, specifically people like Karen Bennett, who I bring out a lot in this paper, Jonathan Schaeffer, who's a very influential philosopher, and other philosophers similar to him, have said actually fundamentality needs to be a staple of metaphysics now. So what does it mean for an entity to be fundamental? And that's what a lot of philosophers are trying at the moment to bring out. And there isn't a clear and sort of agreed understanding of what fundamentality means, but a lot of philosophers have favored Karen Bennett's approach. And so I try to sort of focus specifically on that. And just sort of to flag up something, the way I sort of like to do analytic theology or analytic philosophy of religion is to use a lot of tools and techniques which are seen to be generally agreed upon by philosophers. So what, for example, and hopefully we're not going to divert off in what I'm saying, but you might, people who look into sort of analytic theology and the Trinity, they might have come across things like relative identity. So relative identity is a sort of a theory of the Trinity. And some philosophers have used it to try and bring out the meaning behind certain terms within the Trinity and how to make sense of it. Now, one problem people have faced with bringing stuff like relative identities there is that a lot of philosophers don't see that as being something which is generally taken to be correct.
Yeah, it's quite controversial.
Yeah, it's a controversial thing within contemporary metaphysics. And so one objection that people raise, and this happens a lot with the doctrine of the Trinity, is why are you using these esoteric, exotic notions to bring out something which is complex in itself? We should be using things which are generally taken to be tools and techniques which philosophers employ in multiple areas of metaphysics to then apply that in the Trinity. And so a lot of my work and what I'm trying to do is exactly that, to say, well, actually, what are terms and things and tools and techniques that generally philosophers agree upon? One of the things that philosophers and a lot of influential philosophers agree upon is this idea of fundamentality. And a lot of philosophers have actually said Karen Bennett seems to be onto something with her understanding of fundamentality. And so her understanding centers around this idea of building. Now, building is just basically a term which is used by Bennett and others to capture certain relations that we find within reality. So you might have compositional relations, you might have constitution relations, you might have specifically what I'm going to talk about, grounding relations. Now, these are relations which seem to be what philosophers would say they're sort of carving nature at its joints. It seems to be things which are at the using the term fundamental, at the ground or basis of reality. Grounding, composition, constitution. These are things which are evident within our reality, and they are very important relations which we need to know more about. And building is just basically a term which brings all of these relations together. Relations that build other relations, build other entities. And so what I'm then doing with Bennett is saying, well, let's go with this building understanding of fundamentality. And the way then she understands that is, To be fundamental is just to basically be a basic building block of reality. You are at the ultimate layer of reality. If you're a fundamental entity, you're at the ultimate layer of reality. There's nothing lower in the layered structure of reality than you, okay, whatever it is. And so a fundamental entity is one who is at that sort of bottom level of reality. And why that entity is at the bottom level of reality is because that entity is not built by anything else, and it is the builder of everything else. And so there's nothing that builds it, and there's nothing that is not built by it.
Yeah.
And so, sorry, I don't know.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that obviously, so a lot of these terms hopefully will get explained. I think a lot of people, especially perhaps some of my audience, people who might be new here, might get a little kind of wary and concerned about certain terms and philosophical usage of certain terms. And of course, my approach to analytic theology is just, as is Bo's, is just to try and restate basically just what the Father said.
Yeah.
And I think that in this paper, if I explain to the audience as we go, it's going to be clear that that's pretty much mostly what's going on here, I think. So yeah, I think like 99.9%. It's mostly just because of terms. But
yes.
Yeah, could you explain what a building relation is?
Yeah.
Exactly. And what grounding is?
Yeah.
That you use in the paper.
Yeah. So like I was trying to bring out, I think I completely agree with your approach and with Bo's approach as well. So I think that's what we need to do. I mean, if we're going to state and clarify the doctrine of the Trinity, we need to be clear about what the doctrine of the Trinity is, and we need to be grounded upon the historical basis of it. So I would completely agree with you and say we as analytic theologians, we should not be coming up with our own theories and coming up with things which are not historically grounded, but we should say, what did the Father say? What did Scripture say? And how can we clarify it with our philosophical tools? And so that's what I exactly was trying to do with this paper, utilizing this notion of building, this notion of fundamentality, and this notion of grounding. And so, as I was saying, building is just a term for a certain class of relations. So Bennett sees it not as a single relation itself. So building is not taken to be just a single relation, but it's taken by Bennett to be a term which captures a range of different type of relations. But these relations form a natural resemblance class. And what I mean by that is they are basically similar. So they're different relations, but they are doing sort of similar things. And the main thing which they are sort of doing is that they are generative relations. They are relations which connect entities, but one of the entities is built by another entity and is less fundamental than that entity. It is generated in a way by that entity. And so building is a relation which captures that sort of idea, that you have this connection between two entities, and one of the entities is generated in a directed sense by the other entity. And so there are different relations. So as I was saying before, there is compositional relations, so part-whole sort of relations. The parts are in a way, or the whole, whichever way you see it, is generated by the other. Or you have a constitution relation where a constituted entity is generated by what is constituting it. And then you have grounding, which is a thing I'm going to speak about a lot more, where one entity is grounded by another entity. And so the idea here is that you have this relation which is captured by this term building, but all it's sort of doing is stating in the clearest way possible that one entity is generated by another, and because of that generation is less fundamental than it. And so building allows us to bring sort of in a clear way to individuals that there is this sort of hierarchical structure of reality. there are sort of, if you think of reality as a whole, you have things which are at a higher structure of the reality, and you have things which are at a lower structure. And the things which are at a higher structure are generated or built by the things which are at a lower structure than that specific entity.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can go with an example. Let's say you have something in the class of biology. Okay, so you have an organism. The organism is grounded by something which is more fundamental than it. And so that could be a physical state of that entity. So my physical state, or my quarks, or whatever you might find in physics, is more fundamental than the organism which is grounded by that physical state. And so we have this sort of layered structure of reality, and what is connecting these entities within this structure of reality are these building relations. And specifically, what I think, and a lot of philosophers think, is the key one is a grounding relation. So you have this relation of grounding, which falls into the class of building relations. And so I think it'll be helpful, unless you have another question for clarification, to sort of bring out what grounding is. And
yeah, go ahead.
Like
it's these are all kind of asymmetric relations, right? So one thing builds, if A builds B, B doesn't build A, so B doesn't depend on, sorry, A doesn't depend on B, but rather B depends upon A. So it goes one way. And I like the way that you, and I think this is useful language, generative, because the Son is eternally generated from the Father. So you can see that there is terminological overlap if you really want there to be, which is the important thing to remember. So
exactly.
Go ahead and explain grounding.
Yeah. So grounding, as I was saying, is a relation which falls into the class of building relations. And so grounding is, the way I sort of conceive of it, is in line with Jonathan Schaeffer. And it's a relation which is a directed dependence relation. And this relation is a directed dependence one because it has certain formal principles which govern the relation. And these formal principles, and there's quite a number of them, but sort of the key ones are that a grounding relation is an irreflexive relation. That means if you have an X, for example, okay, if we're using it as a term, and so if a relation is irreflexive, you just basically have the idea that the X cannot ground itself. So if there's a grounding relation there, the X, the entity that we're talking about, does not ground itself because grounding is irreflexive. But it's also asymmetrical. And the idea here is, as you exactly were saying, is that if you have X and you have Y and X grounds Y, then Y does not ground X as well. And so it's directed in that specific sense because it stems from one entity to the other and not vice versa. And then it's also transitive. So if you have X, Y, and Z, X grounds Y and Y grounds Z, then X also grounds Z as well. And so you have this transitive relation. And then sort of the other one, and I bring a few more principles out, but the important one sort of for our conversation is that it's a necessitating relation. Mm-hmm. So if X grounds Y, then X necessitates the existence of Y. And so it's not a contingent relation that's holding, it's a necessary one. And so it's very important that plays a part in this idea of eternal generation. Mm-hmm. And so you have this directed dependence relation, which is governed by certain formal principles. And the idea here is that there is a connection between two entities, which we call grounding, which is this directed dependence relation. And if an entity grounds another entity, then that entity, the grounding entity, is more fundamental than the grounded entity. And why it is more fundamental is because it is an entity which is, in a way, exactly as you were saying, it's generating the other one. The other one is receiving its reality from the grounded entity, and it's not vice versa. And so you have a dependence there with the grounded entity but you don't have the dependence of the grounding entity. And so there is a fundamentality structure that you have, and grounding really brings that out. And it's the connection which most philosophers believe is relevant for the idea of fundamentality. But what I also bring out is not just the idea of grounding. Grounding plays a part there, but the main idea is really this understanding of absolute fundamentality, which I sort of was speaking about earlier. And to be an absolutely fundamental entity in this sort of fundamentality framework is just to be an ungrounded ground of everything else.
Yep.
So if you are absolutely fundamental, that means that you are at the bottom level of the layered structure of reality. Then you are unbuilt. That means you are ungrounded, and you are the ground of everything else in that layered structure of reality. And so what I then sort of do after sort of the long process of trying to explicate this notion of grounding, fundamentality, and building, is that I try to apply this to the doctrine of the monarchy of the Father. And specifically what I tried to show is that the Father is understood to be the one God in the sense that he is the fundamental divine person. And what I mean by that is he is the ungrounded ground of everything else in the layered structure of reality. And that includes the Son and the Spirit, because they are in that layered structure of reality. And so he's fundamental because he's the ungrounded ground of everything else. But the Son and Spirit are not, because they are grounded by the Father, and they are not the ground of everything else. So they don't fulfill those two conditions. They are grounded by the Father, but they are not the ground of everything else, because there's one thing that is not grounded by them, which is the Father. And so they do not fulfill the conditions of being absolutely fundamental, but the Father does. And so he's the sole fundamental divine person in the Trinity. And I believe that was the relevant sort of concept that we need to have in front of us for the idea of this nominal sense of the word God. The Father is nominally God. He has the name God because he is the fundamental divine person. He's the ungrounded ground of everything else, and he is divine. The Son and the Spirit are derivative entities. And what I mean by that is they just are grounded, and they are not the ground of everything else. Yet they are still divine. And so this is not negating their divinity. They are still omnipotent in the same way the Father is. They are omniscient and perfectly good as he is. But one thing that they lack is that they are not fundamental. They are derivative entities because they are grounded by the Father.
Yeah,
so,
I think the phrase that you keep reiterating, ungrounded ground, I guess would be, should be setting off any kind of thoughts of people who've read the Cappadocians, that they constantly talk about, unsourced source, principle without principle, cause without cause, root. Even I think they use root and fount. Origin without origin. I mean, these are all commonly used in the Cappadocians, and so I think this is kind of just adding on another one using ground, which just means the exact same thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, and I did quote this in my paper, that Karen Bennett, who's not a theist in any sense of the word, and she hasn't done any research on this stuff, but she actually uses the term for a fundamental entity, the unexplained explainer, which is quite interesting because that fits exactly with this idea of the Cappadocians, that the Father is unexplained in that his existence is not explained by any other entity, yet he is the explainer of every other entity and their existence. Why they exist is in virtue of the Father. The Father does not exist in virtue of anyone else. So it was actually quite interesting. And I made sure that I put that quote there because I did feel it just fit actually with the idea and the language that's normally used by the Cappadocians and other theologians who are favorable to the pro-Nicene position. But something I do want to sort of bring out as well is the idea, and specifically this is a debated thing within contemporary metaphysics, but Jonathan Schaeffer, being a very, very influential metaphysician, supports this idea. And I think it's very important that we we sort of, as I was saying, we use concepts which are taken on board by these types of metaphysicians. And he believes specifically that grounding is analogous to causation. And so I tried to bring out in my paper this idea that grounding is not just a, random relation that we're just bringing in to fit into this Trinitarian framework, but it's actually something which fits quite seamlessly with what we're trying to do, or what I believe the pro-Niceans were trying to do, is that they were trying to capture this idea of causation. But we do need to understand that I can be corrected on this, but I really don't believe that the Cappadocians had the same understanding of causation that we have. I mean, the way that we understand causation, which is being influenced by people like David Hume, or in contemporary metaphysics, you have people like David Lewis, where we have this idea of a diachronic form of causation, which I don't believe is exactly.
And diachronic means through time, like causation.
Yeah, through time. So the cause preceding its effect and all those things, and it takes a temporal sequence for the effect to be generated. I don't necessarily believe the Cappadocians and other pro-Niceans and Aristotelians and individuals who are working with this issue would have had the exact same understanding of causation that we do. But
I just don't think that causation needs to be diachronic at all. Yeah. Like my understanding of causation from my reading is just the idea that A causes B if B is necessarily connected to A in some way.
Yeah.
In some kind of relevant way.
Yeah. So you could have that position as well. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that what you have with grounding is a relation which I believe captures everything that the pro-Niceans were trying to say, because they were using causal language. They were using the word causation, and they were using generative language. But grounding is all of that. Grounding is a generative relation in that the grounded entity inherits its reality from the grounding entity in a generative fashion. But also grounding is analogous to causation. It's not causation, but it's so similar to it that it has a species similarity to causation. And so you can use the language of causation when you're referring to a grounding relation. And that's what Jonathan Schaeffer does. And I bring this out as well by using, which we definitely don't need to go into, but structural equation modeling, which is, we won't get to it, especially this late. But yeah, so not to sort of go into it, but structural equation modeling is a form of modeling which is used by philosophers to flesh out causal relations. It's very prominent within sort of metaphysics and the metaphysics of causation. And they use it and say, this is the best way to understand causation using structural equation modeling. And then what you see Jonathan Schaeffer doing is that he basically says, well, actually, we can do the exact same thing with grounding. We can use structural equation modeling in a grounding context as well. And what that reveals to us is that grounding is so similar. It's analogous in such a way to causation, because you can do all the things that we find in the causal context in a grounding context as well. And so what we then have with this analogous relation, which is grounding, is that you can use all of the language that the pro-Niceans were doing with grounding. You can do that, and you don't have to basically think, oh, well, actually, maybe I'm using a relation which, if the Cappadocians were here today, they would not have probably favored. I really do believe, with my heart and soul, that if the Cappadocians and other pro-Niceans were aware of grounding in the way that we are today, I think they would exactly use this language, because it's exactly what they are trying to say, that there is a generative connection between the Son and the Father and the Spirit, but in a way that it's synchronic. It's happening at a specific point in time. It's a necessitating thing in that the Son exists in a necessary manner because the Father exists, and it's analogous to causation. And there's so many, it's directed, it's irreflexive. I mean, all the stuff that we want, and I believe the Cappadocians were saying, you find in a grounding context. And I believe they would have affirmed this type of relation as being exactly what they were trying to say, in that the Father generates the Son. I really believe it's the idea that he grounds the Son in this specific fashion. And I just wanted to quote
a couple of things just to where you can see more similar language to this, and this is patristics for perhaps Orthodox, but not for others. But this is from the Synod of Constantinople in 1285. It's one of the Palamite synods, and it says that, quote, according to the common mind of the Church and the aforementioned saints, the Father is the foundation and the source of the Son and the Spirit, the only source of divinity and the only cause, unquote. And another one is, quote, for there is no other hypostasis in the Trinity except the Father's, from which the existence and essence of the consubstantial Son and Holy Spirit is derived, unquote. So yeah, I just wanted to add those in just to...
Exactly. So I think it's that we shouldn't, I think, well, in a way that you can be weary of philosophy in a contemporary context, but I think the way metaphysics is at the moment is very favorable towards theistic positions, and so we should utilize a lot of the things that these influential metaphysicians are using and researching into, because I think it can really elucidate and capture what we find within the authoritative texts that determine our understanding of the Trinity and of the Incarnation and other doctrines like that. And so just to sort of encourage your listeners, there is great work happening in metaphysics at the moment. And I think in a sort of a collaborative sense, we should be working together as analytic theologians and philosophers and systematic theologians to utilize these tools to help further elucidate the doctrine of the Trinity and other doctrines. And this is not to say that we're going to capture exactly what these documents are saying, but we can provide, and I think we can speak about this later, we can provide ways in which people can grasp it, and it can help us. And so you don't always have to, say, oh, well, we don't understand it. It's a mystery. Actually, we can understand to a good level these concepts by utilizing these metaphysical notions.
Yeah, and obviously we've spoken about mystery, and I want to affirm mystery with God, and obviously we'll talk about this later on. But Bo's spoken about this, that it seems the Cappadocians they had mystery, mystery in places, but it seems like some of the things that are kind of relegated to mystery about the Trinity in these days just weren't some of the things that they considered to be particularly mysterious, especially when it came to things like the tritheism objection and whatnot. So yeah, I'm of the opinion that if you're very, very patristically grounded, if you've read the Fathers, and I'm laughing because of the grounding discussion. Yeah. If you've read if you've read the Fathers a fair amount, and you've been Orthodox long enough, I think as long as your spiritual father's given you a blessing to do so, you can read through analytic theology, and I think you'd be able to pick out what's going off the rails and what isn't. And that's what I find myself doing. So when I hear Craig, this is very obvious, but there's even more subtle things. Even when reading material ontology stuff, I want to keep my realism immanent. I want to all this kind of stuff. So anyway, that's a digression. Back to the paper. One concern people have is about subordination. Could you talk about the three different senses of subordination? Because I just want to say subordination means under in rank, like literally that's what it translates to. And obviously that's ambiguous because you can have, what does rank mean? So maybe you could explain that and how you kind of guard against an ontological subordination.
So specifically in the paper, I do focus on trying to ward off this objection, because I think this is the main, and if I'm honest, only objection that I do believe someone could raise against this position. You can't raise, I believe, a tritheistic, if you really understand the terms being used, you can't raise the objection of tritheism and other related objections. But I think the only one someone would sort of have alarm bells ringing in their mind as well, there seems to be a subordination of the Son and the Spirit to the Father, which I would happily affirm. I think subordination or subordinationism is not a problem in and of itself. It's a problem when you subordinate the Son and the Spirit in a specific way. And so what I then try to do in the paper is to try and clarify the different ways in which the Son and the Spirit could be subordinate to the Father. And this is based on the work, so good work of two philosophers. So you have Mark Edwards and Ryan Mullins. Specifically, Mark Edwards does the work here, and Ryan Mullins is responding to him, where they sort of clarify and classify the different types of subordination that was found within church history. And what Mark Edwards was trying to show in his paper, which was published by Theologica, is the idea that subordination is not actually a heresy within the church. It was a specific type of subordination, which was taken to be heretical. And so what we have, and what I sort of bring out is there is the idea of ontological subordination. So that's one type, which is the idea that the Son and the Spirit are subordinate to the Father, so under in rank or lower in rank to him, based on their essence. So they have a different essence to the Father, and it's a lesser essence. It's an essence which lacks some great making attributes, and so they are not of the same essence of him. They are not homoousios. They are less than him in a way, and so that is clearly one of the subordination types of subordinationism, which was rejected by the councils. It was quite clear in the early part of the 4th century, when sort of you had the issue of Arianism, that the church was battling against this problem, and the declaration was that the Son is homoousios with the Father, and so he's of the same essence, and so he's not ontologically subordinate to the Father. And then you have a Constantinople, the affirmation as well as the Son and the Spirit as well being homoousios with the Father. They're of the same nature, they're of the same essence, and so ontological subordination is a problem, and it should not be affirmed by anyone who has pro-Nicene inclinations. But then there are sort of other types of subordination, which I believe the Monarchy of the Father sort of leads one to. And the main one is atheological subordination, which is the idea that the Son and the Spirit share the same essence as the Father, yet they are lower in rank to him. Okay, and the way that Mullins and Edwards bring this out, they don't really define what it means to be lower in rank. But they share the same essence, which is the key thing. So they're not ontologically subordinate to him, but they are lesser in rank to him, to the Father, in some way. And so I believe, and specifically the way I construe the Monarchy of the Father, is that there's an affirmation there. There is an affirmation in the Monarchy of the Father that the Son and the Spirit are of the same essence as the Father, yet they are lesser in rank to him. And the way I bring that out is that they are derivative entities and he is fundamental. So he's fundamental, and he's more fundamental than them, and they are derivative entities because they are grounded by him. Yeah. And so you have that affirmation of that specific subordination in the way I construe the Monarchy of the Father.
Yeah.
Now, what you then have, and what I sort of bring out in the paper, is you have an objection raised by Ryan Mullins, where he believes that actually any type of subordination of an atheological fashion seems also to be an ontological subordination as well. Because someone could raise the point of saying, well, why are the Son and the Spirit subordinate to the Father in that specific way? Why are they lesser in rank? And sort of, the way I say it, well, is because they're derivative and the Father is fundamental. But then what Mullins tries to show in his paper, and the one I respond to, is, well, if they are lesser in rank to the Father, they're lesser in rank to him because they lack a certain property that he has, which is that of aseity. The Father has aseity, and the Son and the Spirit lack that. They are non-ase in a specific way. And so why they are lesser in rank is because he's fundamental and he's ase, he's of himself. But the Son and the Spirit are non-ase. They are of the Father. They exist in virtue of him. And so they lack that specific property. But then Mullins sort of says, well, that seems to be clearly then an ontological subordination, because they lack something that the Father has in their essence. And so they are ontologically different to the Father. They are not of the same essence. They are not homoousios. And so he believes then that the affirmation, and so just to clarify a point, Mullins doesn't deal with the Monarchy of the Father in his paper. the paper I respond to, but basically I construe it in that way that it applies to it. So it's sort of my further work where I take his argument and apply it to the monarchy of the Father. But by doing that, I'm basically saying, well, his objection is saying, because the Father is fundamental and Aseity, and the Son and Spirit are non-Aseity and they're derivative, they must lack a certain property that he has, and so they are not homoousios. And so you have an ontological subordination with this specific doctrine and this specific Trinitarian view. And so then I try to deal with that. And I don't know if you'll have any questions for clarification before I...
No, I mean, a lot of this stuff is very good, and it's stuff we've gone over already. And I'd like to, if you want to move on, but I'd like to read. I don't know if you've read Basil against Eunomius, but he has a whole section where he talks about the ranking question that Eunomius brings up. And for me, a lot of the stuff Mullins is saying is literally just rehashing Eunomianism, just word for word, like pretty much every single argument. And he kind of tries to spruce it up and make it sound like it's new, but it's not. And I like his critiques on simplicity, but I think that's the case. And so I'd like to read that, but I think the problem is just misunderstanding of thinking that causation somehow implies a different nature, which is. And I mean, obviously, Gregor of Nyssa talks about the three flames, and I'm sure you're familiar with that, and how if there's this kind of eternal flame that's always existed and it causes another flame to exist, that flame isn't less flame than the uncaused flame. And so if the rank question is something that Basil talks about. So if you want to say a bit more, go ahead. And I just like to read this quote because I think it's like super relevant.
You can read the quote first, and then I can then sort of add my bit after.
Yeah. So he says, has there ever been someone so audacious as to introduce innovations about the divine doctrines? If the Spirit is third in dignity and in rank, is there some necessity that he be third in nature as well? Perhaps the word of piety transmits that he is second to the Son in dignity, but we have not learned from the Holy Scriptures that a third nature is necessary. Nor do the preceding claims make it possible to infer such a conclusion. The Son is second to the Father in rank because he is from him. He is second to the Father in dignity because the Father is the principle and cause by virtue of which he is the Son's Father, and because we approach and access the God and Father through the Son. Even so, the Son is not second in nature, since there is one divinity in both of them. Likewise, it is clear that even if the Holy Spirit is below the Son in both rank and dignity, something with which we too are in total agreement, it is still not likely that he is of a foreign nature. What follows will make this conclusion clear. Just as all the angels share a single designation, so too they share a nature that is absolutely the same. Yet some of them preside over the nations, whereas others accompany each individual believer. An entire nation, however, is more honorable than a single person to the same extent that the dignity of the nation-leading angel is necessarily greater than that of the angel who has been entrusted with the care of a single individual. No one will deny that every believer has an angel that accompanies him, acting like a kind of pedagogue and shepherd and directing his life, if he calls to mind the saying of the Lord, quote, do not despise one of these who are least of all, for their angels continually behold the face of the Father in heaven, Matthew 18:10. And he goes on, and then he carries on for a bit, just pointing out that there's different ranks among the angels, but they share the same angel nature. And he says, so then what is the point of this argument? It is this: if something is second or third in rank and dignity, it does not in every case have a different nature. For in the case of angels, one is a prince, another a servant, and yet all are angels in nature. While they differ in dignity, there is communion in nature. And he just goes on for a little bit more. Basically, you get the idea. There is what's the patristic term is a taxis. There is an ordering. There is a ranking of the divine persons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I affirm everything you've said, and I think the way Mullins is trying to, the way he's trying to bring it out specifically is just to say, okay, so if we have the property of Aseity, so not being dependent or derived on any other entity. He takes that, and he believes that a lot of other philosophers take aseity to be a great making property. So something that a perfect entity, a perfect being, a divine being must have is that they must be ase. And so because the Son and the Spirit don't have that, they lack a great making property, and so they're not perfect in the way that the Father is. And so they lack this property, and so are not homoousios with the Father. And then, yeah, so he says, I mean, clearly, if that's the case, if we take aseity to be a great making property, then there seems to be a problem here. And so I would, just in defense of Mullins, I would say, though, because he's not directly working with, and I think he needs to, because I think there'll be a lot of things that we'll deal with the objections, is that he doesn't do a lot of patristic sort of research and sort of dealing with the patristic arguments. So I think he does do that in a way when it sort of favors what he's arguing for. So he'll do that with eunomius, but then you wouldn't see, well, there's a counter objection to eunomius by Gregory of Nyssa or Nazianzus or something like that. So I don't think, he does that, and that doesn't really help his case. But if I, just in defense of him, I would say from a purely analytic context, so the one that he's working within, the objection, as I was stating it, would follow. I mean, his conclusion would follow, because he's saying, well, if aseity is a great making property, and to be homoousios, all the persons have to share all the great making properties, then because the Son and the Spirit are, non-ase, they don't have aseity, they lack a property which the Father has, and so they have a different essence. And so with that analytic context, his conclusion follows if, so it's a valid argument, but then what I would say is an unsound argument, because one of the premises is false. And so what I bring out and what I try to do in my paper is show that. I try to show that one of his premises is false, which is the idea that aseity is a great making property. It's a property that a divine person must have. And so you'll see his work and people like William Lane Craig and others who have furthered this objection that aseity seems to be a great making property. And I was just trying to show that actually I believe that's a false assumption. I think.
Can I just ask? So what actually is the argument that aseity is a great making property? Is it just kind of like, well, theologians nowadays pretty much are mostly agreed that it is? Is that basically the argument?
That's what I was trying to say. So I think it's an assumption that's made.
Well, here's something I would want to ask Mullen. Isn't omniscience considered a great making property generally? Yes. And isn't he an open theist?
Okay. So, I mean,
not to talk about Mullins, there's just something that came to my head.
No, it's fine. Yeah. So I think it depends how you define omniscience. So, Mullins would definitely affirm omniscience. He would just say that we need to refine our understanding of what omniscience is. And so
that's true, yes.
It's the same with Swinburne. So Swinburne, being an open theist, he would say, well, I affirm omniscience, because for Swinburne, it's just to know the truth value of every proposition that's logically possible. And so he would say, well, it's not logically possible for an entity to know future free actions. And so if the future is open, God doesn't know it, but it's a logical.
The open theist position.
So it's still affirming omniscience. It's just redefining it, really. So with aseity, I believe it's an assumption that's made by a lot of philosophers without a lot of argument for it. It's just saying, intuitively, aseity seems to be a great making property, so it just must be. And so what I try to show is I try to question that assumption and say, well, actually, I think we need to rethink this assumption that aseity must be a great making property. And the way that I do that is by trying to focus on understanding what type of property aseity is. Because in sort of contemporary philosophy, you'll have this, and it's difficult to define the terms, but you'll have this distinction between intrinsic properties and extrinsic properties. I'm not really going to go into the depth of what these mean, but at the most basic level, an intrinsic property is just a property that an entity must have independent of its surroundings. So it has this property independent of its surroundings. An extrinsic property is a property that an entity has dependent upon its surroundings. Okay, so it depends upon its surroundings to have that specific property. So the example I was using, and this was in a recent discussion with Mullins as well, is so the property of being the son of someone or being the daughter of someone. That's a property that I have, but I have that dependent upon my surroundings, basically dependent upon me having a father or having a mother. So I have the property of being a son because of my father or because of my mother. And so that will be an extrinsic property. But for example, you might have, let's say, the weight of an individual or the color of an individual or something like that. The color of an individual is not dependent upon its surroundings. I can have this property or lack it, and it doesn't matter what surrounding I'm in. But I cannot have the property of being the father or being the daughter or son of someone if I don't have a relation that I'm standing in with another entity. So intrinsic properties and extrinsic properties are things which philosophers have sort of made a distinction between when it comes to different types of properties. And so what I then try to show is that there is an assumption here, and where the assumption lies is that a lot of philosophers are taking aseity to be an intrinsic property of an entity. And what I try to show by using some contemporary philosophy is basically that actually aseity should be classified as an extrinsic property. And because it's an extrinsic property, it cannot then be classed as a great-making property. Because a great-making property, as Mullins and other philosophers take them to be, is an intrinsic property of an entity. So you have a great-making property, but a great-making property is an intrinsic property of an entity. It's not extrinsic. So that means then if aseity is an extrinsic property of an entity, then it cannot be a great-making property. Because like I said, great-making properties are intrinsic. They are not extrinsic. And so by showing then aseity to be extrinsic, it's not a great-making property of any entity. And then that means that Mullins's argument that the Son and the Spirit must have aseity if they are to be divine as the Father is, homoousios, is false. Because what it's being shown here is that the Father can have aseity and the Spirit and the Son can lack it, and yet they would still have the same class and set of great-making properties that the Father has. And so aseity is not a great-making property, and so it doesn't need to then be shared by the Son and the Spirit in order for them to be homoousios. And so I've sort of undercut the argument here by questioning the assumption that's made by philosophers like Mullins that aseity is a great-making property, because it's not, because it's extrinsic and it's not intrinsic. Yeah. And so I sort of show that in a metaphysical sense.
Yeah, obviously you have these little kind of 4 check boxes.
Yeah.
But the simpler way of doing those 4 check boxes for just people who aren't being really hyper accurate is just to say that the property of being uncaused depends on there not being other beings, basically.
Yeah.
Because that's how it's because that's basically, it's kind of conceptually implicit in the notion.
Yeah. So that's sort of what I do. I use this sort of what I call the independence criteria, which is put forward by some philosophers, specifically David Lewis and Ray Langton. And what is very important, and I tried to bring this out with a previous discussion with Mullins as well, is that this criteria that I use is taken by metaphysicians to be a necessary criteria for intrinsicality. So what I mean by that is, for a property to be classed as intrinsic, it needs to fulfill this criteria. If it doesn't, then it cannot in any way be classified as an intrinsic property. It must be taken to be extrinsic. And so what I then show is that actually, when you look at this criteria, the property of aseity does not fulfill this criteria. And because it does not fulfill this criteria, it is not intrinsic. And this is not just my own thinking. Other philosophers, and this is sort of in private correspondence, I actually ran my argument with some other philosophers, and they affirmed this. So these are philosophers who who are not working in theology at all. These are metaphysicians, and they ran my argument, and they were actually saying, well, how could you take Aseity, when they understood it, to be intrinsic? It's just clearly not. And so what is interesting is Aseity, not just by myself, but other metaphysicians who hold to this criteria, it's clearly classified as extrinsic, and they would not even bat an eyelid saying that it should be classified as intrinsic because it fails this criteria. And so this is an assumption that's made in theology, but it wouldn't be made in general philosophy. And so again, if we have our analytic theological sort of hats on, and we're trying to use the tools and techniques of contemporary philosophy, this is a criteria that we cannot do away with. We need to utilize this criteria. And by utilizing it, we can clearly take Aseity to be an extrinsic property and not an intrinsic property. And so because the Father has it and the Son lacks it, there is no problem with them having the same essence. They have the same essence despite this distinction between them, which I've tried to bring out in this paper.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's pretty much bang on.
Yeah.
I know Bo also talks about how we tend to identify what kinds of things are based on. We don't have to ask whether or not something is uncaused in order to determine kind of what kind of thing it is.
Yes.
I think that's another useful point against the Aseity being included in the kind essence of deity, I guess.
Yes.
Like not everything that's divine has to be uncaused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And something I want to also say, and I tried to say this with Dale Tuggy in my conversation with him, that if you reject this criteria that I brought out in the paper, then you need to bring out and come up with your own criteria for intrinsicality. Because like I was trying to say, this is assumed to be a necessary element of intrinsicality. And so by my criteria, or by this criteria, Aseity has to be classified as an extrinsic property. And so unless you want to, do away with this argument, you have to do away also with this criteria. And then you have to come up with your own criteria, which will then be able to field all counter examples that can be brought up. So it's not an easy task to go and do away with this. And so, and it was interesting that Dale, actually affirmed that in a way, and that you would need to come up with your own criteria. And I don't think someone can do that. And so what I am then saying is that this argument seems to be quite strong, because you're not just taking on Aseity, you have to take on intrinsicality in this specific conceptualization of it, which is taken by the majority of philosophers to be correct. And so I wouldn't take that upon myself to try and come up with one. I don't think I'll be able to. So I think, I'm looking forward to individuals who might try to do that and try to show it, but I don't think it would be possible. And so I think with sort of Bo's argument as well, we have two sort of arguments which, can be put forward. And if I'm honest, I think this objection should be put to bed based on these two arguments that Bo is saying about sort of kind essence and things like that. And I think with this extrinsicality argument as well, we can sort of put this eunomian argument to bed, because I think it needs to be, because I don't think there's ways to get around these arguments. And it's just sort of furthering again what I believe the Cappadocians and others were saying against Eunomius, just in sort of contemporary language.
Yeah, here's an interesting thing. And now I'm realizing that we're at like 1 hour, 10 minutes. So maybe we can just stick to building Monarchy paper, and maybe we can do a second interview. On
that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, no problem.
Because then maybe that gives us some more breathing room.
Yes.
Bo told me, and I think I read this, I think it's in the Against Eunomius, either of Nissa or of Basil that I've read. But he told me after I read them that the kind essence argument is basically in I think is Basil, and the argument about the extrinsicality of Aseity. I wonder if you could and I think that's what Bo's doing, because we're interviewing Bo in 2 days' time, and he's going to make the argument that if there is a God, a necessary being who is omnipotent, has all the great making properties, all the divine properties of the divine essence, essential properties, this being God would necessarily generate a second divine person. And he's making an argument for that. I think he's a really, really strong case. But I wonder if, and that's one way of doing it, but I wonder if you could almost also kind of weaponize this idea of aseity being an extrinsic property against the person who wants to insist on a Unitarian view, in the sense that, and I think this is in the patristics, they say that you need to have a triad, and I haven't read this extensively, but it sounds like you need to have a triad in order to have an ase being, because of this, the fact that this property is extrinsic. You need other beings present in some sense in order to ground the meaningfulness of that property. So it's just kind of an amusing thought I'm having right now.
No, that's actually interesting, and something. Yeah, I'm going to actually think deeper on that. Because that could be a way. Yeah. That is an interesting way to think about it, and I think that would be able to be, I would say, a weaponized argument against a Unitarian understanding of God. Yeah, no, I'm going to think deeper about it. Yeah, I think that's good.
Yeah, please do, because I'm doing lots of stuff and I don't have the background you do, but because there is an argument in Maximus that, and I think it comes from, it's related to Platonism, that you kind of have triad transcending both monad and dyad, because you have this like the same and the different, and then you need some third thing to kind of to ground the sameness and the difference. I can't really cash out right now. But this is something like that, and it's in Saint who's going to be canonized 2025, Saint Demetrius Staniloy. So it's there. So yeah, that's what that's just my musings. I need to revisit kind of Trinitarianism really properly, but I think there's a lot there that, what for me, it's like we're looking at the fathers and it's like, oh, they were right all along kind of thing. You know what I mean? So that's why whenever I see this kind of logical problem of X Christian view, and I see the kind of stuff you and Bo are putting out, just kind of restating the patristics contemporarily against basically contemporary eunomians, and still showing that that everything's fine, like you're saying. It's like I'm not really too put off by these objections, because I think someone's gonna find a solution at some point. In modern terms, it's just kind of a sense of trying to excavate the fathers and make them relevant in contemporary debate and argumentation.
I completely agree with you. I mean, for what it's worth, I'm really confident about the monarchy of the Father as being just the correct understanding of the doctrine of the Trinity, and it's not facing all these problems which I believe other views of the Trinity do. So this, the famous logical problem of the Trinity, and you'll hear about it all the time. I just think there is no leg to stand with that objection with the monarchy of the Father. And other objections like this, the eunomian argument, all these sort of things, I really believe they fall to the wayside, just because it is the correct understanding of the doctrine of the Trinity. And it is the historically grounded and biblically grounded view of the Trinity. And so I just, assuming the infallibility of Scripture and, the conciliar declaration. I mean, it's just going to be correct. And so it's just, having to go into the patristic literature and having to think deeply about these issues, and we will find the solutions there. And it's just, exactly that, just restating these things in sort of contemporary language I really think this is the way to go if we're going to understand the Trinity better.
And you wanted to say also that, so I remember before we went live, we were talking about kind of like mystery, right?
Yes.
And I said to you, it sort of worries me, these analytical discussions, sometimes, when it's almost like the philosophers are making it sound like, we have this kind of exhaustive knowledge about God, and we need to just kind of have this exhaustive knowledge about God when we don't even understand physical reality, or we don't even understand physical reality as well as a lot of the analytical theologians seems to think they understand God, right?
Yeah.
And that seems a bit worrying because God's supposed to be, he's supposed to be transcendent. He's supposed to be, not circumscribable by, as I say in my philosophy videos, not circumscribable by the intellect. Whereas created reality should be, in principle.
Yeah.
So I was talking to you about how I wonder if a lot of these cataphatic ways of approaching the Trinity, like what you're doing in these papers, if they're really hitting at reality exhaustively, or if they're just, as Aristotle might kind of think of it, like abstractions that don't completely capture the reality of the thing, and they have kind of a more instrumental use. And you responded. I was wondering if you could
So my sort of position on it, this idea of using philosophy and metaphysics, all these sort of things, is not to say that we've got the actual reality in front of us now. We've got everything understood. We've comprehended the nature of God and all these sort of things. I don't believe that's possible. We won't be able to do that. And so I sort of make a distinction in my mind between the idea of comprehension and apprehension. We will never be able to comprehend the essence of God and comprehend God at all. But we can apprehend what he's revealed to us in certain ways. And the way I would understand that with philosophy is that, and it's following sort of the work of Alvin Plantinga on these ideas, is that we can put forward models of things in theology. So certain doctrines that we affirm to be true, we can put forward models. And a model is just basically a way to understand how something could be so, how something could be true, a way that it could be understood. And this is not to say that we've captured the reality and saying, aha, this is actually how it is. Oh, God must be built or unbuilt or built, and fundamentality and grounding. It's not like we've actually, said this is how it must be, but it's just a way for us to be able to understand this is how it could be so. And this is enough to ward off the objections of logical incoherence. Because logical incoherence is saying there is no way that the doctrine of the Trinity could be true. There's no way. Doesn't matter what you say, it cannot be true. That's basically the most simple way that someone is putting an incoherence objection, is saying.
And that is a realist claim.
Yeah.
That is a strong realist claim.
So, for example, if you had, someone said, I've seen a squared circle. Well, obviously that's logically incoherent. It can never be so that you could ever see a squared circle. It's just not possible. But when you show something to be possible or something to be coherent, all you need to do is to say, well, this is a way that it could be so. This is not to say that it is exactly in this way, but it's a way that it could be so. Okay, this is a way that God could be understood to be. And so the way I sort of approach metaphysics and philosophy and analytic philosophy of religion is that we are putting forward ways that this could be true. And this is enough and sufficient enough to ward off the objections of incoherence. And so this is a way that the doctrine of the eternal processions and eternal generation could be understood. It could be understood through grounding, or the monarchy of the Father could be understood through fundamentality and all these sort of things. And this is not to say that this is actually the way, but this is a way that it could be so. And so it could be correct, but it's not to say that we've actually grasped the mystery and said, God is not mysterious anymore. We've understood him through our analytic philosophy sort of, concepts. No, we haven't. But we've been able to apprehend certain elements of him in a model-like fashion, which allows us enough to understand it and to be able to communicate about it. Because at the end of the day, as Christians, we are an evangelistic faith in that we have a mandate to go and share the gospel. We have the mandate to go and share it to all nations. And those nations will include nations where people are, very intelligent, and
nations of analytic theologians.
Yeah, of analytic. You might, for example, as I was doing before, you'll go to speakers' corner and places, and you'll meet people who are actually, clued up in metaphysics, and they will say, "Oh no, but Trinity doesn't make sense." And so, by being able to say, actually, this is a way it could be so, you are able to ward off these certain objections. And so, the way I think philosophy can serve us is by doing that, by allowing us to deal with these objections. But it doesn't mean that we've then just depleted the mystery of the doctrine. We haven't at all. We never will be able to do that, given the transcendence of God. But God has enabled us through philosophy to be able to communicate him effectively,
and through revelation, of course,
and through revelation, to be able to communicate about God in an effective manner in certain societies, to ward off objections. And so that's what I see philosophy as. It's just warding off objections, but it's not grasping God in our hand and saying we have him here. We will never be able to do that. But it's a way just to be able to communicate things in an effective manner. And philosophy can serve us in that way. But yeah, that's the way that I'll take it to be. But it again, just to encourage people, these are difficult concepts, these are difficult things, but they are useful in a certain sense. And so I don't think we should just throw them away, because I don't think the fathers did that. I don't think they didn't throw philosophy away, but it served a purpose. But it was a limited purpose, but it served a purpose, and it can do that today as well. And I think that's why people should be, delving deeper into these things, because it can serve certain purposes in certain contexts.
Yeah. And I mean, like I've mentioned St. Demetrius Aniloi already, he is very emphatic in his volume 1 on the knowledge of God in his dogmatics, that the patristics have to be made relevant for today, for modern contexts.
Yes. Yeah.
Because the wisdom there's timeless. We can't just stay stuck to kind of antiquated notions. We have to take the essence of their thought and present it in modern discourse.
Yes.
And,
exactly.
and if that means using grounding relations and stuff like that, which would basically just express the essence of the thought, like you say. I think it's very, very, very hopeful for both evangelism and apologetics.
Yeah, exactly. I exactly agree with you, and I think it can do that, and I think that's what we should be doing, and that's what the fathers would want us to do, is to communicate what they, the revelation that they were communicating in our language, and that's what we're doing. We're just using our language and our concepts to be able to express the same reality that they were doing. And I think people shouldn't see it as as something which we shouldn't delve deeper in, but we should, with always a grounding in the patristic, so that can guide our reading of, as you were saying you are doing as well, it can guide our reading of metaphysics, because there will be things which people will fall into in metaphysics which are going to be against the patristic witness. And so by having that grounding first in scripture and the patristics, we can have a guided reading of this and take what is useful to serve our purposes of communicating the revelation that's found in Christ. And I think that's what we should be doing. But it's always the patristics and history first, and not philosophy first, and that sort of way. But philosophy does serve that purpose. Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm doing. I mean, that's what I did with the Trinity, is I read the Cappadocians and Athanasius pretty much in their entirety before I read the analytical stuff, which I'm going to do with Christology as well. But I think the Christology stuff is, I mean, when I first came, after, like I said, I read the Fathers, when I first came across, I started looking into modern analytic Trinitarian stuff, I was just like, nope, that's not right. No, that's tragic. And then I came across Bo's stuff and I was like, oh, hang on. And then it turns out he's Orthodox. So great. And then, you at Speaker's Corner came along and it's, same thing. So yeah, I think the Trinitarian stuff right now for an Orthodox position is really in a good spot. The Christology, I'm not so sure it's in as good of a spot, but I think it like I said, the data is all there in the Fathers. It just takes an analytic theologian who's got the creativity and the historical knowledge and groundedness in the Fathers to make that happen, in my view.
Yes. Yeah. No. I agree with you, man. I agree with you. Awesome.
So it's been really great having you on. You said 1 hour and a half max. So I suppose in terms of questions, no one really posted any questions, but I was just looking at the chat and the gist was kind of like this same old. I'm sorry to say it, but it's basically what's the word? Just nonsense that like all causation has to be temporal, or has to have temporality involved in it, when it seems to me all you need to prove is that you can have a necessary asymmetric relation between two things that's synchronic, as you say, that happens at the same time. And yes, even though that has the notion of time, that doesn't per se or necessarily negate that it could be, you could have a synchronous state of affairs that's eternal or outside of time. Like I've still not seen the argument for why that has to be the case. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Specifically, I mean, with grounding, the philosophers who are sort of developing the notion, they don't say anything that you need to affirm some form of temporality. The whole idea is that if we are saying at the same time, it is the idea that you have the existence of another entity depending on the existence of another entity at that specific moment, let it be atemporal or not, but it's at that specific moment that's happening. And so the main idea is that you don't have to have this sequence of events taking place when it comes to grounding. And so, I just think when we just understand this notion more, we don't have to bring into account all of these sort of ideas of time. It's just not there in the literature. So it's not.
Well, here's one thing I was thinking, and maybe you can correct me on this. I don't have your acumen, but it seems to me like you could just say this same kind of thing about God and his attributes, in the sense that God, I don't know if you'd use a specific relation of grounding, but God grounds his attributes, right? Like if he exists, his attributes exist. But you can't say, it doesn't go the other way around. And so it seems to me like that there's something similar going on there, and so it just seems to me odd to, as a theist, to kind of make that kind of argument that you couldn't have a synchronic, like asymmetric relation like that exists from eternity. So I mean, what do you think? Am I off the reservation here?
No, you are. No, you're on the money there with the idea that there is a dependence relation between, if you, let's say, assume that God has properties in that way, there's a dependence relation there, and it's asymmetric in that the properties depend upon God, and in that sort of sense. If I'm sort of thinking about this in this specific way, though, I don't think a lot of philosophers use the relation of grounding in that specific context. They will use another relation of ontological dependence, which is actually different from grounding. But it's if I'm honest, it's just a different relation, but it's very similar. But it's the same thing that you don't, I mean, it gets to your point. You don't have to say that there is a temporal sort of sequence or time has to be involved in the dependence there. But it's the same idea that there is a sort of a dependence link between properties and the entity that bears them. And there is no need to bring any form of temporality into that sort of picture there. So you get the same thing. And it's just, I think what you have with grounding is that you don't have to fall to any of these objections that you would have if you were using a pure causal relation, which you would need to field the objection of, how do we make sense of this notion without having sort of time involved there. But I'm just saying grounding, the good thing is that you don't need to go into those objections because those objections aren't relevant to the relation.
I just think it was always a straw man to think that when the fathers used the term cause, they meant like what you said, like a Humean or a pure causal relation. Like it's just, I don't know how you could look at their analogies about, sun and light and fire and heat and the lily and the scent of the lily and all this stuff and conclude that what they mean is that like, it just seems like a highly uncharitable reading. And it's just people not doing their history or their patristics. So
it's anachronistic as well in that people just reading our understanding of terms directly and saying that's what they, that's exactly what they were saying. With, again, what I was saying is obviously the fathers didn't have the notion of grounding there. But what I'm trying to say is that grounding captures what they were trying to say. And so in that model-like fashion, it allows us to say this is how it could be so. And I think that's the mode of sort of the way that we should be operating is in that fashion. but we shouldn't read things into there. And I think that's what they do with this objection, is that they're reading our causal concepts, which has been formed by people like David Hume, into the fathers when it wasn't there. And yeah, that's just what we shouldn't be doing if we're doing our history correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, I think that's that, and it's been an hour and a half, so we'll have you back on perhaps within the month or whenever you're free to do on the second paper, which is about another very interesting area, and maybe I'll have read more of Lowe by then. So
awesome.
It's been really great having you on, Josh.
Thank you, Lewis. I really appreciated being on. Like I said, your channel's great, so thank you very much for having me.
I've put your papers in the description if people wanted. There's 2 papers I mentioned in the description, so if people want to go check that out, they can go do that. Awesome. And so what other papers do you have forthcoming? You said you had one about the Trinitarian love. You said you had that.
Yes. So there's a few in the pipeline at the moment. So I have one under review with the Philosophy of Religion journal. It's been under review for quite a while. What I understood from the editor was that they were struggling to find a reviewer who was, he said, willing and capable to review it, but they found one at the end, but they're still waiting for the review report. And it's on the love argument. So I'm trying to reformulate and introduce a new love argument for the Trinity, which captures what Swinburne was trying to say with the love argument and Richard of St. Victor, but doesn't fall into sort of the issues that are raised against it, and also fits with tradition in that the idea that the Trinity is a revealed doctrine. So it's not just something which we can use our a priori reason to get to. I try to put forward this love argument in a way which captures what people, generally believe about the Trinity, that it's derived from revelation. And so I tried to put forward a love argument that way, using, again, some contemporary metaphysics and some contemporary ethics as well, bringing this together to sort of put forward this argument. So yeah, I'm waiting to come back. It might be a load of rubbish and that the reviewers say, what is this?
I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah,
I hope it's published. I want to, I mean, you send me a draft, even if it's not published.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I will do. But yeah, so I'm waiting for that. Another one as well on, which is on grounding as well. So it's accepted, but it's just needs to, I just revised it. So then it has to go through sort of a second reviewing round, but it's on grounding. So basically what I do in that paper is I just further flesh out what I'm trying to do with the building the monarchy of the father paper. But I try to flesh it out in a way which shows how, and this is controversial obviously on this channel, but the idea of the filioque, how it can be affirmed, yet the monarchy of the father, the sole principality of the father, can be affirmed as well. So you can have the sole principality of the father, there being one, so a single principle and source of the Son and the Spirit in the Trinity, yet there's a possibility for the filioque to be affirmed as well. And I try to do that by bringing into account grounding and seeing how that works. So yeah, that's in the pipeline. What else is there? So there's a few other things. There's one on, not related to the Trinity at all, which is on the existence of God. So it's a fundamentality paper again, but it's trying to put forward a new inductive argument from fundamentality for the existence of God. So I recently delivered that paper at it was an online conference, a pre-recording I gave there was a conference in June at Birmingham called a Global Philosophy of Religion Conference, and I delivered that paper. But then the larger form of it should be coming out hopefully soon. Sorry, I've just got loads of things in my head. So I think that was the main ones. And then I'm responding to some simplicity stuff. So I recently had a paper published a month or 2 months ago where I put forward a new account of divine simplicity, which I believe affirms all that we want to say about simplicity, God being identical to his attributes and all those sort of things. But it's a way that I think your contemporary philosophers would also see as being plausible. So I'm not going to get into it here, but it's a new account which gets what we're trying to get to with simplicity, but also will tickle the fancy of those who have problems with simplicity. So people like, for example, people like Alvin Planting and Swinburne, who very famous philosophers, but they believe simplicity is just completely wrong. I basically try to show actually how all that they are trying to say and they hold to can be affirmed by someone who affirms a strong doctrine of divine simplicity. So that paper was published with the European Journal for Philosophy of Religion a month or so ago. And so, yeah, that came out. And then I'm just going to use that paper to apply to an argument that Ryan Mullins and Joe Schmidt recently published, where they basically say simplicity is wrong, classical theism is wrong. So I tried to use my account to argue against them. So I'm writing that at the moment, and hopefully that should be publishing. So anyways, there's loads of things. Whilst I'm also trying to take care of my 3 kids. Yeah, so crazy life at the moment. But
wow, you have time for your kids with all that?
Yeah, I don't know how. It's my super wife.
And for the football.
Yes, yeah, exactly. But yeah, no, God's good. God's good. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. It seems like
Awesome.
it.
Yeah.
Well, it's been great having you on. And like
Thank
I said,
you.
we'll have you on in future. It's great to hear all that stuff.
Yeah.
Particularly looking forward to the love paper. For everyone who's watching, have a wonderful night or day, wherever you are. And God bless.
God bless. Thank you.